And on many days, we have multiple author events. Please go to politics-prose.com/events. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat button to purchase Alex's brand new book, Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music, on the Politics and Prose website. Or if you live in the DC area, please come by the store. We've expanded our hours. We've opened up to customers since mid-July. Masks, social distancing, and plenty of hand sanitizers, of course. We're going to have a Q&A portion later, and you can type in a question by clicking on the Q&A button, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many questions in our allotted time, and we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address your question. Finally, I want to thank everyone who's tuned in. We really depend on our loyal customers, keeping our business afloat. Tonight we have a conversation between Alex Ross and Anne Midgette discussing Alex's new book. And some words, opening words from our partner for this event, the Wagner Society of Washington, D.C. Alex Ross has been the music critic for The New Yorker since 1996 and has written 2 previous books. The Rest is Noise, Listening to the 20th Century, and his collection of essays, Listen to This. Besides music, he's written many pieces, many profiles and essays on history, literature, current events. And I like to point out 2 nature essays, which I really enjoyed, on his visit to Death Valley and to visit the world's oldest trees, the bristlecone pines. His latest essay out this week in The New Yorker is entitled Masterpieces Black Scholars Confront White Supremacy in Classical Music. I also wanted to definitely talk about Alex's blog, which is also called The Rest is Noise, therestisnoise.com. His has links to all these essays and now has a huge section for reading Wagnerism. It has a chapter by chapter audiovisual companion with hours of music and opera, full operas, a guide to Wagner's works, again with lots of music and audio and video links, list of recommended recordings, videos and books, a Wagnerian glossary, and lastly, some examples of bad Wagner poetry. Anne Midgette was the music critic for the New York Times, then came to the Washington Post as chief classical music critic, where she finished her tenure last November after 11 years. She's currently working on a historical novel about the woman who built pianos for Beethoven. I wanted to especially mention a couple of works that Anne did. She was the co-author of The King and I, written with Luciano Pavarotti's longtime manager, Herbert Breslin, and also co-authored Leon Fleischer's memoir in 2010 called My 9 Lives. And Mr. Fleischer, of course, passed away this past August. And I definitely wanted to point out Anne's work last year, and I guess early this year, with a lot of groundbreaking articles exposing the sexual and other misconduct that seem to be rife in the classical music world. So thank you to Anne. And now we have a Wagnerian short prelude. And for that, I'd like to introduce the chairman of the Wagner Society of Washington, who are co-hosting this event, co-sponsoring the event. And I'd like to introduce the chairman, Mr. James Holman, who will tell you a little bit about the society, then bring on Alex and Anne. Hello, Mr. Holman.
Hi, everybody. I am Jim Holman, and have been chairman of the Wagner Society of Washington since its inception in 1998. We think the Wagner Society is one of the most vibrant institutions of high culture in the nation's capital. Our 400 members have enjoyed monthly programs, lectures, concerts, seminars, 3-day retreats, and other events for 23 years. We have in addition helped more than 100 singers with the potential for careers singing Wagner. And in this regard, we've been blessed by our partnerships with the greatest Wagner singers and teachers: Thomas Stewart, Evelyn Lear, Dolores Zajic, and Luana Duval. Well, we're just one of 150 active Wagner societies around the world. Wagner societies are a phenomenon rather unique in the music world, and no doubt Alex will tell us why. But I'm not here to talk about my society. Rather, I'm just thrilled to co-present here with the iconic Washington bookstore, Politics and Prose, and the great music critic and my friend, Anne Midgette, to present perhaps the most influential person writing about music and about Wagner in America today, Alex Ross. Alex told me, and Alex, it had to have been more than 10 years ago, that you were struggling to write your Wagner book. I and all Wagnerians have been waiting for this day ever since. And make no mistake, Alex's book, Art of Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music, is the most significant book about Wagner and Wagner's protean influences of our generation. Written with that insight, a detachment, and yet commitment that is unique to the work of our very best music critic, Alex Ross. So it's a great privilege for me to introduce Anne and the author of Wagnerism, Alex Ross.
Well, thank you for that, Jim. And I second the encomiums to the book, Alex. And I also note that you were emulating the protean nature of your subject by appearing in nonstop conversations about your book for the next 2 or 3 weeks. So I know that you are seeking to demonstrate in your book that Wagner can be many things to many people, and you seem to be performatively enacting that as well. So I hope these conversations will be collected as some sort of performance art at the end of it all. I had so much fun reading this book, and what I didn't anticipate was I kept putting it down to pick up other books that I wanted to read or reread, and I found in many ways it was more of a book about literature and about the visual arts, but really about literature than about music in some ways. And I was curious, is this something you anticipated going into it when you plunged into this sort of Wagnerian terrain?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much, Anne and Jim and Andras, for those lovely introductions. And I so much wish I could be back in my hometown of DC in person. My first 2 books, the events that I had at Politics and Prose, were very special, with my family being there and my old high school teachers. And I think Paul Piazza might be out there watching, as well as my brother, Christopher, but I really wish I could be there in person. Yeah, I mean, very much central to the attraction of taking on this subject was the cultural immersion, and not simply the musical immersion, because there have been thousands of books about Wagner, and some of them behind me on the shelves here, and I didn't necessarily feel that there was call for one more biography or one more sort of collection of essays, at least from me. I don't think I have anything shatteringly new or original to say about Wagner per se. But in terms of the influence, it turns out that there isn't quite a book out there like mine, trying to put together comprehensively, or as comprehensively as possible, Wagner's influence on all the art forms from his own lifetime to the present. So there've been a lot of wonderful individual studies of one aspect or another of this phenomenon, but no one has been foolhardy to try to bring it all between the covers of one book. And I thought it was worth the attempt. So I think this is sort of a gallant attempt at the impossible, because it's an enormous phenomenon. It's a sort of staggering how Wagner became an ism, became something like a movement sweeping through the art forms, especially at the turn of the century. But this was really, the idea of being able to immerse myself for an extended period in this kind of, especially the decadent wonderland of the fin de siècle, which has just always been a period that I've been perhaps unhealthily attracted to since high school. Actually, I read Karl Schorsky's great book, Fin de siècle Vienna. That kind of set off this fascination to some degree. And to be able to, and I spent a lot of time in college studying Joyce and sort of other aspects of the literature of the late 19th, early 20th century. So to be able to go back to this period and revel in it, but also just following this thread, which gives, I think, us an unusual angle on some of these very familiar figures. People just aren't necessarily used to looking at Joyce or Proust or Virginia Woolf or Willa Cather through the lens of Wagner, or sort of this musical influence. They're more accustomed to, there's no avoiding the Wagnerian angle on Thomas Mann, because that was just so dominant throughout his life. But for a lot of the other figures, I think there's a kind of freshness and unexpectedness, just following the whole history of this period along the curious thread of Wagner and Wagnerism.
Well, you pick up a lot of threads things that one doesn't know. One of the delightful things about the book is all the sort of little nuggets of information that emerge too. And Thomas Mann writing about specific Wagner works without saying that they're actually Wagner works, and then revealing that later is sort of this wonderful, weird, unnecessary tick on his part.
Right, yeah.
But I was like, the way you define Wagnerism in the book does not necessarily include Wagnerian music. In a way, Wagner's musical influence is not a subject of the book, and the composers who were influenced by his music rather than by his themes are not really included. There's not a whole lot about opera. Was that a conscious decision? Was that a necessary decision given the amount of material you had?
Yeah, I mean, it was both conscious and I think absolutely necessary, because it's already quite a long book, and if I attempted to incorporate Wagner's influence on Verismo opera and Debussy and Schoenberg and sort of on through the 20th century, it just would have become utterly impossible. And that's also not what's unique about this phenomenon. Of course, he was massively influential on music, but not necessarily more so than any number of composers before him or after him, Stravinsky and so on. And whereas the influence on the other art forms, this was quite unusual. I mean, I don't think in cultural history we've ever seen another case of a composer becoming a quasi movement in the arts, becoming identified so strongly, especially with artistic vanguards, symbolism, and aspects of early modernism and futurism, and sort of moving into the late 20th century even. And that seemed to be what was really deserving of scrutiny. And this question of, well, how does one art form influence another, and how do non-musicians react to music? And it's quite difficult to pin down, I think, because the languages that we have set up to analyze particular art forms sort of break down when you have this sort of foreign influence coming into play, and it's sort of very hard to quantify. I mean, sort of a painter goes to see Lohengrin as Kandinsky did as a young man, and it had this tremendous impact on him by his own testimony. But well, how exactly is that manifest, in the work? But that's the mystery of all the different forms and sort of transformations that these strong impressions under the influence of Wagner took. Sometimes negative impressions as well. I mean, sort of the rejection of Wagner, or a kind of constant struggle and kind of back and forth with Wagner. Auseinandersetzung is the great German word. That is such a rich subject in itself, and that's also this ambivalence toward Wagner is a constant theme throughout the book, and that's also very interesting. It sort of mirrors my own ups and downs with Wagner over the years. I mean, this is right from the beginning. Certainly he had his worshippers, but it was just so common for people to feel conflicted in front of this overwhelming phenomenon in front of them.
It was something that's kind of baked into his reception. You have a line about James Joyce oscillating between passion and boredom, or something that I thought was very amusing. I think most of us who love Wagner have been through that to some extent, despite the undeniable pull. On the other hand, you were talking about like the young Kandinsky, these young people going and having these profound impressions, but for people who are coming to music who are not musicians, there's also sometimes a naivete of reaction. It's a much blunter reaction than the reaction of a musician. So it's obviously of necessity focusing on another aspect of Wagnerism than the musical aspect, because people who are coming from outside music don't have the vocabulary at all. But yes, it's a stronger manifestation than most other artists. You point out how Wagner was really all things to all people. I mean, all these people having different strong reactions make of Wagner what they want to make of Wagner. Obviously, the thing you're fighting against today is the conventional wisdom that Wagner is this terrible anti-Semite and a chauvinist and a bigot. And you deal with this in the book very subtly and adroitly in showing that it's far more than that. But standing right here at this point in our history, when all these things are coming to the fore in so many ways in our culture, how do you explain Wagner or explain this phenomenon to somebody coming to it for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is this is the only thing that a lot of people know about Wagner now, is that he was Hitler's favorite composer, that he was a propaganda symbol in Nazi Germany, that he was a ferocious anti-Semite. And that's all absolutely true. And in no way is this book designed to hide or disguise that, and that it increasingly becomes the central story of the book. It just kind of looms and looms, and then by the 13th chapter on Nazi Germany, it takes center stage, and everything that has happened with Wagner since is in the shadow of the story of Wagner in Nazi Germany. But what I very much wish to do is to establish the extent of his influence, I think, which many people have forgotten or simply aren't aware of, the breadth of the political influence from left to right, the fantastic variety of these artistic influences from the extremely avant-garde to the extremely conservative. And I think most interesting, the way he proved inspiring for a number of people within minority communities, within oppressed communities, early gay rights activists, some feminists, African-American Wagnerism, and yes, Jewish Wagnerians. And this is absolutely fascinating. And I never want to use this to say that this somehow outweighs the Nazi influence and then sort of the Hitler connection, but it should be part of the picture, and so sort of I'm trying to restore the kind of richness of the picture, and then sort of let people decide for themselves. I mean, someone may read through the book and decide, well, that's all very interesting, but Wagner was just in the end absolutely hateful, and these horrible things happened in his wake, and that's that. And I don't feel that way myself, but it's I'm not going to argue with that, and this is a figure who arouses deep passions and deep revulsion, and I respect the revulsion. I've felt it myself, and especially early on, I just found him intolerable. And so, this is a history of an event. It's something that happened in cultural, the cultural life of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so, the kind of moral conclusion that people might want to come to is, it is ultimately up to the reader, and it's up to kind of society and culture as it evolves, and maybe in coming years it will be decided that Wagner should, no longer be a part of our cultural lives. But I predict that there's going to be no getting rid of him. He has been, he has been the object of such opposition for so long. I mean, people have been trying to quote unquote cancel Wagner since the 1850s, and he just keeps coming back, and he keeps having this I think positive and constructive influence on those who might be expected to reject him, and so it just sort of keeps going back and forth endlessly.
Well, he was full of contradictions at the time he lived too, when he would, throw out some statement and then seem to contradict it 20 years later, and like many thinkers. And as far as canceling him, we're having that conversation about the entire Western musical canon as well. It's not just him, that question. But I was intrigued to see your explanation that the Nazis found some of his work insufficiently useful for their own propagandic purposes, like Parsifal, with the emphasis on Mitleid, on compassion, being very downplayed because the Nazis didn't really want a lot of Mitleid in their worldview. And the fact that he was taken as a freedom sign, that Toscanini was championing Wagner as the good Germany well into the war. We didn't have that sort of First World War thing of writing out the Germans.
Yeah, no, it's one of the great ironies that from 1917 to 1918, during the First World War, just all German culture was considered sort of out of bounds. Some music was still played, but there was this sort of enormous drive to kind of demonize German culture, all of German culture, as the source of the military aggression of the Huns and so forth. And there's a very different attitude during the Second World War, and this idea of rescuing the good Germany, and sort of embracing the refugees, the emigres, such as Thomas Mann, and separating the sort of glories of German culture from what was happening in Nazi Germany. It was very much a sort of mainstream idea, and then a number of figures start questioning that attempt and sort of returning, but in a much more sophisticated way. When you're looking at what Theodor Adorno wrote about sort of the deeper cultural and ideological roots of Nazi ideology in German, sort of grand German bourgeois culture of the 19th century, very much including Wagner. So we sort of oscillated back toward a sort of darker vision, and then sort of we oscillate back again. I mean, sort of in historical circles in recent decades, the idea that Germany was on this special path, irreversibly moving toward the Nazi catastrophe, has been very much in question, and people are looking at a much more kind of expansive and sort of open-ended understanding of what was going on, especially in Imperial Germany and the Kaiserreich. So this is an endless ongoing conversation within Germany as well, of course. And so I try to lay it out as clearly, I won't say objectively, I mean, it's sort of possible to be objective about these things, but just trying to present a rich and complex picture of a very complicated phenomenon emanating from a very complicated man who had enormous ideological contradictions, who was a ferocious anti-Semite, but in terms of his political ideology, it's quite difficult to align with contemporary ideas of left and right, or even early 20th century ideas of left and right. And so there were aspects to his worldview which the Nazis found inconvenient. Hitler absolutely adored Wagner, but made very little use of Wagner's political writings and ideas, and that sort of had to be put at a certain distance. It was more effective for the Nazis to use Wagner as a sort of this towering patriarch of German culture, German greatness, rather than to get into the specifics of his political thinking, because it is just a can of worms being opened up. It's just, still have it simply doesn't make any sense. It just can't be reduced easily to sort of slogans and propaganda.
Well,
so
you say that Hitler
just trying to lay all that very clearly, and again, letting people decide for themselves what this relationship is ultimately.
You say that Hitler was probably not even that aware or interested in Wagner's political philosophy. He just liked the music. But one thing I found amusing too is that the Nazis kept wanting all Nazis to go see these operas, and people were bored by them and found them long and tedious. It was not necessarily opera of the people the way that the regime sort of was hoping.
Yeah, well, this was very much what Hitler wanted. He had this sort of fantasy of bringing Wagner and bringing classical music and opera to the people and making it cheaper and building larger concert halls and opera houses, and sort of everyone would fall in love with it the way he did when he was young. But there was sort of this oppressive, obviously dictatorial kind of urge to subject people to these experiences. And so he would have kind of drunken, lower level Nazi party people herded up in bars and sort of dragged to Meistersinger at the Nuremberg party rally and prodding underlings who were falling asleep during Tristan and Isolde. There's a kind of dark comedy to it, where sort of one aspect of Hitler is this, I don't know how to put it. I mean, I just feel like I occasionally see this kind of person in classical concert halls. Just sort of this sort of tyrant of kind of imposing his sort of personal taste on everyone else, and it's sort of beside the point in terms of the larger horror of what Hitler and the Nazis did, but yeah, it's sort of coming back to this idea that Hitler fell in love with Wagner very young, I think before he really had any political ideas whatsoever. And it was just an overwhelming experience for him, seeing Lohengrin, seeing Rienzi. And there's long been this idea that he had this revelation when he saw Rienzi and Lin's sort of future as a leader. And a couple of scholars have gone through that, and they find that doubtful because it seems to have been this kind of epiphany projected backward by Hitler himself. I mean, how much can we rely on Hitler's own, testimony of his life? And I think the preponderance of the evidence suggests that, first he fell in love with Wagner, and then a number of years later, he began to develop these extreme political convictions, which had many other sources aside from Wagner's political essays, and those essays really ultimately may not have been a particularly important source for him, even though it has to be said indirectly, some of those more immediate hyper-nationalist, anti-Semitic thinkers would have been influenced by Wagner, themselves. So this is the sort of indirect chain of influence.
But there were certainly followers of Wagner who were writing vile stuff that did lead to. But that's part of the people turning Wagner into all things for all people as well. I mean, people making of Wagner what they will, which is what we all do with all the artists we love. I mean, everyone's relationship to art is about that sort of possession. It becomes part of you. But, and with regard to that, you show how Wagner became all things to all people. You have Black Wagner, gay Wagner, Zionist Wagner. But I felt like you were a little coy about your Wagner, and you said you didn't want to write a book of your essays about Wagner, and yet your writing about Wagner in the book just stands out so beautifully. There's so much about Wagner, especially in the beginning. It's like almost a stealth Wagner book interleaved through the Wagnerism book. And then in the postlude, you beautifully sum it up very elusively in a couple of pages. And I felt like there's a whole nother book in the postlude that could someday be written. But I wondered what you think about that statement and how you feel, having written this book, where you stand with regard to Wagner, how this has changed your feeling of it, evolved your feeling of it. Does it make him more or less somebody you turn to, or?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it was important to just give some lay of the land, especially I wanted this book to be somewhat comprehensible to people who have never thought much about Wagner, but simply find the topic of this, figure's influence on culture interesting. So I wanted to have relatively tidy introductions to the major Wagner works in the early chapters, just as a kind of orientation. And I think also it was important for me to establish my own quote unquote take on Wagner. And I'm not exactly sure what that is, but I find I find the operas enormously compelling as psychological documents, as renovations of mythological themes, of course, purely as musical works, tremendously original, tremendously powerful, but it is these sort of lightning strikes of sort of trying to make particular points about the Wagner works. Much more interesting, I think, was when other major figures are conveying their ideas of Wagner, whether it's Proust or Joyce or Willa Cather, and to have a kind of theory of Wagner, a sort of conception of Wagner, emerging through Wagner scenes and Wagner moments in their works. I think that's very valuable, and so the book is to some extent a kind of series of deep perspectives on Wagner from this select group of figures who knew their Wagner very well, because a lot of other figures in this book were kind of enthusiasts without a great deal of musical knowledge or sort of depth of experience, but someone like Mann or Cather or Joyce, who was such a musically sophisticated man. I think that's just certainly more interesting than my own ideas about Wagner. But then it is I can't deny that ultimately it is a book about Wagner in the end, and I sort of appended my own ups and downs, this sort of little memoiristic postlude, as a way of just sort of an example of how this goes on, this kind of agon, this back and forth, this Auseinandersetzung with Wagner sort of goes on, and my own path, which of course felt very unique to me, and very somehow it's of course you think that your own experience is unique, but it turns out it was kind of recapitulating all of these prior experiences in various ways, and which is why I put it at the end rather than the beginning, and also maybe just a slightly perverse gesture, because so often with a book like this, the introduction will say, well, here's why, I personally find the subject of, the history of Dutch shipbuilding, so compelling because my grandfather was a Dutch shipbuilder, and, so come along and, and if I put it at the end just to be difficult, I suppose. But I like, I like this idea. I do this sometimes in my New Yorker pieces, just sort of to save that sort of personal component for the end rather than the beginning. It can feel like a kind of intensification, in place of a grand wrapping up, sort of turning into this, adopting a much more personal voice. I just find it.
I felt like I came through the book going, why? And then the postlude was sort of answering some of the questions that I thought were left unanswered, but very tantalizingly. As I said, I feel you could expand it quite a lot.
Yeah, sure.
I know that you had to cut a lot from the book because you've been working on it for all of these years, and you've talked about having to strike a lot from the manuscript. Did you start with this framework for the manuscript, these 14 chapters, and cut down? Are there other chapters that ended up on the cutting room floor? Are there other topics you wanted to go into?
Yeah, no, the first structure is kind of different. It was much more divided thematically in terms of Wagner in literature, Wagner in painting, sort of early modernism, and getting into the political questions. I think it was just 5 or 6 chapters. So it's going to be sort of a series of big thematic essays. And then at a certain point, I found myself wanting to do it somewhat more chronologically, but also coming up with these geographical divisions: French chapter, Victorian England, and Gilded Age America, but more or less sort of moving chronologically and sort of taking on the form of a more sweeping cultural history, as opposed to sort of a series of essays, which is actually the same thing happened with The Rest Is Noise. That was a very similar evolution that took place with that book. And just as I got deeper into it, I was finding more and more that I wanted to include, and not just sort of focusing on a few big figures, but sort of bringing out all of these curious little kind of eccentric back corridors of Wagnerism and the young adult Wagner books. I'll show, I have one of them here, Wagner's Heroines, sort of this whole, like, a fair number of books that were written for children or teenagers, telling Wagner stories in somewhat bowdlerized form, leaving out the incest and other unattractive features.
You mentioned one called A Day in the Life of Richard Wagner is like a young person's biography by, I forget the name, it was a female writer of the early 20th century.
Yeah, actually, I didn't put that out in the book, but that's an interesting example. And so I wanted to sort of bring all this in, but then of course I got to the point where there's too much, so I had to start, cutting things out. But, I wasn't chopping out entire chapters or even getting rid of, in sort of discussions of entire major figures. It was just much more, a lot of what I was cutting out was just frankly quite tedious. I could sort of do with kind of 3 examples of, third tier occultist satanic French novels on Wagner themes, as opposed to 7 or 8. The others are fascinating, and I'd love to sort of, I don't know, do something with that material. But it's just about cutting out the endless, cutting down the endless string of examples, and it may still feel a little overloaded, a little overburdened, but I like the idea that there is now one book where Wagnerism in all its curious and fascinating forms is, there's an attempt to cover the whole of the field.
Well, that sort of answers something I wanted to ask, because I was curious about your own evolution of your relationship to Wagnerism and to this book as it went along. You feel like you streamlined your own thinking into sort of creating a manageable object out of this disparate morass that you dipped your hand into to begin with, or how does it affect your relationship to wanting to hear Wagner's music?
You asked that before. I didn't pick up on that, but I haven't gotten tired of Wagner himself. And I sort of I go back to it, and it's such a fluid and mutable and ever-changing world, and it always depends on which recording I'm listening to or which production I'm seeing. And of course, Wagner production today is just this extraordinary free-for-all, and you have absolutely no idea what you're going to get next in terms of where the opera is being said and who the characters are, not necessarily the ones that are in the libretto, and so there's Wagner never feels fixed. It's just always a little bit different when I go back to him. And so I haven't tired of him at all. And actually, when I was working on that list of recommended recordings, a lot of this summer, I was just listening to a selection of the great Ring recordings of the 50s and 60s from Bayreuth and Tristan and the Parsifals, the numerous Knappertsbusch Parsifals, and just always finding something new. So and this isn't to say that Wagner's the be-all, end-all, the greatest composer who ever lived. There's a combination of elements here, and part of it is sort of the combination of elements within his person, his abilities as a composer and as a dramatist and as a kind of theatrical visionary, and the other aspects to him. But then, the elements that are brought in when singers are providing, attaching their personalities to the work, directors are giving their vision, and the interpretations. Nietzsche's reading of Wagner changes how you listen to Wagner. I think Thomas Mann's writing on Wagner changes. So not just scholarly interpretations, but these artistic interpretations. And so it becomes this agglomeration of Wagner's, and sort of he's there in the middle, but there's so many other voices participating, I think, in the formation of what we call Wagner. And so it's not just him.
And we know the performance you hear can have a decisive influence on your reaction to any experience. More maybe than people realize. But we do want to open it up to questions, and people are starting to ask questions. So I'm going to turn to a few questions from the audience, all of you invisible voices out there. Yoko Arthur asks, do you think people would have paid so much attention to Wagner's writings without his great music? Was he a profound philosopher, as some people seem to think? He certainly was no academic. What do you think?
The answer briefly is no. And I think there's this amazing quotation from William Ashton Ellis, the notorious translator of Wagner's complete prose writings into English. I have the paperback edition of the Ellis translations, and they're notorious because they are couched in a language which is somewhere between German and English, without quite capturing the best qualities of either language. And it's sort of this murky gibberish that he created, very literal. He knew German, and his English equivalent, can capture some of the sort of difference, but it's just very difficult to read. So assessing, Wagner's writing, first you have to get over the Ellis issue. But what Ellis said was, even if Wagner had never written a note of music, he would still be celebrated as one of the great thinkers of our age, and that's absurd. We only pay attention to these writings because they are attached to Wagner's work, which isn't to say that they don't have interesting ideas. I mean, there are fascinating ideas in Artwork of the Future and Opera and Drama and the essays on conducting, and on the Bayreuth Festival, on the management of the Dresden opera when he was director there, and some actually quite acute, practical, pragmatic observations, which can still be useful today, because he was, for all his wild kind of visionary, revolutionary thinking, he was a great person of the theater, man of the theater. His whole being, I think, goes back to the space of the theater. And even before he was writing music, I think he was acting little, and producing little skits. And so that is really where it all began for him. But it's just very difficult to cope with the prose writings. And when he starts philosophizing, when he starts his speculations about race and Germanness, and sort of spirituality, and trying to mix together different world religions into his own master religion, it is intensely problematic. And even if you're reading, perfect knowledge of German doesn't necessarily help in terms of making sense of this writing, because it is just very, very difficult sometimes to figure out what on earth he's trying to say. But I looked at them constantly, and still look at them, because they are fascinating documents of this man with this mind that was just kind of volcanic, that was just sort of constantly spewing material, and some of it was garbage and some of it was quite interesting.
like many other artists we could name.
Yeah.
We have two questions here that are almost parallel. They both are asking about your relation to new music. One says, you've said in interviews, maybe your most important task as a critic is promoting and exploring new music. Is this book related to this project in some way, or is it a different strand of your work? And the other questioner asks, does this feel more like a project of the Alex Ross of 10 years ago, or do you see a significant connection with your current work? And both questioners stress that they're not saying this to challenge, they're genuinely curious about how you see this relationship.
Right. No, I think this is pretty separate from my criticism. And, a lot of what I write in the New Yorker focuses on new music. And right from the beginning of my career as the lowly junior critic at the New York Times, as you, Anne, once were as well, it was writing about new music that was just most important to me. And I started out, my very first piece was a review of John Corigliano's The Ghosts of Versailles at the Met, and so that's just been central to my mission. I love writing about older music and writing about the classics. But you know, as a critic, that is what excites me most, and I think that's where I have the most to contribute. This is quite different. You know, this is sort of some aspect of this book is the self that I might have become if I had not gone on that path into journalism and criticism, if I had gone to graduate school as I was poised to do in 1992 before the Times offer came my way. I was going to go to Duke. And at that time, I was just heavily invested in so many of the themes that are in this book: the fin de siècle, decadence and degeneration and sexuality and Jewishness and sort of all these themes were kind of circulating through a lot of my undergraduate work, and I was going to continue pursuing them in graduate school. And so this is sort of my other self, my alternate universe coming into being, and yet of course it intersects with themes that occupy my critical writing. You know, what do we do about the great canonical composers, and how do we find new and perhaps healthier angles, perspectives on them, you know, in a changing society and in a culture that just is no longer inclined to venerate what's largely a canon of white male figures, and so how do we negotiate this balance between past and present, and how do we resolve or confront the issues that obviously spectacularly come to the fore with a figure like Wagner? But I think, as you were saying at the start, Anne, you know, they are rife, they are endemic, they are systemic in our whole musical history. You know, racism and misogyny and sort of a kind of a veneration of authoritarian figures and connection with authoritarian politics, you know, goes all through musical history. You know, and I'm afraid to say, you know, nothing by Wagner is as openly racist as the Magic Flute, you know, in terms of the character of Monostatos, you know, or misogyny in Mozart, or anti-Semitism in the Bach Passions. You know, the Jews are named in the Bach Passions; they are not named in Wagner, and so this is not to do a kind of both sides sort of thing. You know, everyone's doing it, so let's not blame Wagner. It's, you know, Wagner remains the spectacular case, but what I resist is kind of a tendency to say, well, just sort of Wagner was just so absolutely awful that he belongs in a totally different category, and if we somehow got rid of Wagner, then everything else would be okay. You know, as if sort of it's the few bad apples kind of conception of musical history, and you know, no, we need to confront it in a much more thoroughgoing way. And so that's been a theme, especially I think in recent years, my criticism, and so in that sense, this book intersects with that. But no, this is a cultural history of the fin de siècle, essentially at heart, and doesn't link up with themes in contemporary music at all, really.
Morris Goldings has a question that I was curious to ask you as well. He asks, to what extent, if any, did the views of living heirs and relatives of Richard Wagner and the writings or reported views of deceased persons of those categories influence you? I was curious because I've always found that writing about Wagner pulls you into this kind of equally fascinating and weird dynastic story of the descendants. And I remember writing for a newspaper once and feeling like I was writing a fairy tale instead of a newspaper story.
Yeah, no, there's no avoiding that. And I think he said, would you eliminate Cosima? And I was saying, you know, absolutely not. You know, Cosima has to be part of the story. I think, I mean, the books that I have, just these books that I have here, I mean, these are all books about other Wagners. Cosima, Winifred, the Wagner clan, Gottfried Wagner's book, the biography of Friedland Wagner, Nike Wagner's book, Telemann is of an honorary member of the Wagner family. And so, yes, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. Of course, it's also just so integral to what went wrong with Wagner's posthumous reputation, the progressive movement of members of the Wagner family deeper and deeper into the creepiest corners of hyper-nationalist and anti-Semitic ideology, and the entrance into the family by way of marriage to Eva Wagner of the truly sinister figure of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the English-born racist philosopher who hailed Hitler as the savior of Germany when they met in 1923 and compared him to Parsifal, no less. So of course, this is part of the book. They're constantly popping up, the members of the Wagner family. And Bayreuth is just sort of there's a kind of, I keep returning to Bayreuth as a kind of meeting place where you can sort of see the figures themselves, the sort of personae, many of the characters in my book sort of congregating at Bayreuth. And sort of just the changing social fabric at Bayreuth is a kind of mirror of the bigger themes. When I went to Bayreuth to do some research in the archive, I spent a lot of time going through these these little books that were put out of guest lists from the hotels. And this was a very common practice to print the names of everyone who was staying at the area hotels in Bayreuth and in other cities, which sort of seems now a colossal invasion of privacy, but no one sort of thought twice about it at the time. So you can see who was at Bayreuth each year, and I found that fascinating, just in terms of seeing these curious patterns, like these enormous parties of young American women who would be coming to Bayreuth around the turn of the century. There was this party from Macon, Georgia, and a couple of other Georgia towns who took over the entire Hotel Goldener Anker during 1 week at Bayreuth. And so there's a whole kind of untold story there, which I actually spent a little bit of time trying to find out who these people were. They had diaries, but that was a detour that didn't lead anywhere. Yeah, Cosima Wagner is a colossally interesting figure. I mean, there's a lot of Cosima in this book. She was Liszt's daughter, daughter of Liszt and Marie Dagoul, the historian of the Revolution of 1848. So she was a French-Hungarian woman from very different background from Wagner. She was extraordinary. She was brilliant. She had a sort of a very powerful intellect. She was extremely conservative. She was really quite reactionary, possibly more so than Wagner himself on certain issues. But she was also, there's a tendency to demonize Cosima. You sometimes find Wagnerians who say, well, Wagner was okay, and then Cosima came along and sort of drove him over the edge. No. Wagner did a good job of driving himself over the edge before Cosima entered the picture. She was a director. She ran a very important music festival. There were few women in culture at that time who had the kind of power that she had. And she was constantly criticized as being too conservative and sort of keeping everything fixed. But I think there's a case to be made for Cosima as a theatrical director and as someone who built Bayreuth into the major institution that it remains. It could have very easily just gone out of existence or become something quite different if she hadn't taken hold of it. And she created her own Wagner. I think this patriarchal sort of grand bourgeois Wagner swaddled in the kind of pseudo-Renaissance clothes, and that was Wagner himself, but that was also an image that Cosima seized hold of and projected very strongly. So I could go on. Sorry, I already have gone on and on, but it's a fascinating question.
No, I think that particular avenue is really interesting, and it must have been hard to keep that out of the book. It's a little bit in the book, but you didn't let it take over the book. And I admire your adroitness in keeping it in there without jumping in the whole way. A question from Catherine Kustansky. I'm curious how you feel perceptions of Wagner and his work have been influenced by the varying presentations between continents. It feels as if the Wagner of North America is not the Wagner of Europe, the Wagner of the UK, or the Wagner of Bayreuth. Does this speak to the elasticity of his work, the funding models between continents, or the expectations of audiences, or all of the above?
Yeah, that's a big theme in the book. I think, you know, the early chapters are geographically organized. It begins with Wagner, the Ring, and the relationship with Nietzsche as a kind of establishing chapter. But then the second chapter is on France and symbolism, Baudelaire to Mallarmé. The third chapter is on Victorian England and Gilded Age America. The second chapter goes back to France as well as Belgium, sort of the second stage of symbolism, esotericism, mysticism, a little bit of Satanism, and Ireland and William Butler Yeats. And then we finally go back to Germany. And so these are quite different Wagners. I mean, the difference between the French Wagner, this sort of magician of the dream state, this kind of unleasher of the unconscious, this occult kind of priest presiding over the formation of this sort of new religion that figures from Baudelaire to Mallarmé and Josephin Péladan, who's possibly the weirdest of all Wagnerians, is just incredibly different from what you find in America in the 1890s, Wagner, the creator of Parsifal, the sort of, this sort of opening up this pure sphere of spiritualized feeling and elevation, and so these young women whom I mentioned were very much sent by Reut to be purified, I suppose, under the influence of Parsifal, and to have this kind of cleansing experience, I suppose. It's almost the exact opposite of how Baudelaire can see Wagner as the sort of conduit of satanic energies, So these are enormous cultural differences, and they're sort of taking Wagner and adapting him to their own purposes, which is, perhaps this happens in an especially prominent way with Wagner because of this elasticity, because of this ambiguity, because of the tendency for people to feel things very strongly when they go to Wagner, but there's something kind of determinedly vague about the content, sort of unfixed about the content of the Wagner works. And so, you see yourself, you see your own concerns sort of mirrored back at you, rather than, the fixed vision of the creator, which is this irony, I think, because we think of Wagner as so domineering, and so emphatic, and you must listen this way, and this is what everything means, and here are the leitmotifs, and this is the Gesamtkunstwerk, et cetera, and yet there's this enormous kind of vagueness in terms of what and I think Wagner actually intended that vagueness to some extent, even as he was so overbearingly emphatic as he talked about his own work. And so both in terms of the individual reactions to Wagner and in terms of the national, geographical reception, you see Wagner being, remade for local purposes and being used as a tool politically, ideologically, culturally. He was just very useful for various groups, various personalities to advance their ideas and advance their own purposes.
It's when you say that we think that we are so certain about what the intentions of various artists are, but one little factoid in the book that intrigued me was that audiences at the time did not see the figures of Beckmesser and Alberich and Mime as anti-Semitic caricatures. That's now almost universally acknowledged that we think that was built into it. But at the time, that was not widely or at all thought of or discussed. It came along much later. And there's a question of influence versus reception that's very hard to parse. We assume that Wagner put it in there and we have to take it out. But perhaps it's posterity that put it in there.
Yeah, that's one of the questions that I had the most difficult time with, and it wasn't even sort of a part of the agenda of the book necessarily, because I'm writing about Wagnerism and so the effect on the question of this very difficult interpretive idea of is Alberich a sort of anti-Semitic caricature is somewhat beside the point for that very reason, because just people weren't really talking about such caricatures back in this period in the late 19th century. Albrecht sometimes, Beckmesser very, very rarely, Mima sometimes, but it simply wasn't a prevalent, a sort of widely recognized way of understanding these characters. And there's also no evidence that Wagner himself thought of these characters in that way. And maybe he was being devious in some sense, but I don't know why he would have hid it necessarily if he had intended it, because that wasn't really his personality to sort of hold things close to the vest. Usually if it went through his mind, we know it. And so and yet it's there. There is something there, and it's just so difficult to pin down, and so difficult to is this just some kind of big unconscious operation? So I continue to go back and forth. Every time I read a new essay on the subject, I feel sort of halfway convinced, by sort of the latest swing of interpretation, and I don't think we're, I think we're very far from having solved that problem, if we ever will.
Yeah. No. We have more questions than we can possibly get to in the remaining time, so I'll pick out a couple more. But AZ Madonna asks, do you ever see people describing things as Wagnerian that you would say are distinctly not Wagnerian? And I think the misuse of that term is prevalent as well. I'm curious what you will say to that.
Yeah. Well, I had a list, which I just sort of stopped collecting at a certain point. I had a Google News alert actually for the word Wagnerian. And so I was getting these weekly reports on absurd things that were described as Wagnerian, some kind of, some moment in a classic soccer game, or sort of something about an army deal with the Boeing company, and et cetera, and they're new ones. I ended the alert at a certain point, but just because I sort of had enough of this sort of particular theme. But someone was just saying that they saw some aspect of Bruno Mars was being described as Wagnerian, or maybe specifically Bruno Mars' sexuality was Wagnerian, and a couple of other things like that. So it goes on, so this word Wagnerian is thrown around indiscriminately. The word Gesamtkunstwerk is also thrown around indiscriminately. It's amusing. I feel like, there's always a fundamental understanding at the heart of it. Just because Wagner is being reduced to, it always means grand, bombastic, sprawling, overbearing, loud, et cetera, and Wagner, of course, contains all those qualities, but ultimately, that is absolutely not that's not what makes Wagner interesting, and actually a lot of the grand, majestic moments in Wagner are background. They are the world in which his characters are living. If you just think about, the procession into at the Wartburg in Tannhäuser, or the entry of the gods, or sort of the hearty, rousing sailors' songs in Tristan, and sort of these sort of grand ceremonial passages are the background, and what really matters. The individual psychological story of the characters is often moving very much against, that sort of ceremonial backdrop. It's attempting to escape, or sort of just kind of in tension with, I think even in Meistersinger, sort of the sort of ceremonial aspect of Meistersinger is obviously something that Wagner loved and relished, but right up to the end, Walter von Stolzing is hanging back from it, and is not sure he wants to be a part of it, and is only persuaded with that rousing speech by Hans Sachs, which is a huge problem in itself, which I won't go into, to join the guild. And so the big Wagnerian spectacle has an ironic aspect to it. The end of Rheingold is absolutely ironic. This is the gods marching to their doom. And what's important amid that grand procession is the Rhine maidens are saying, they're begging for the gold to be thrown back to them, and they say, what is trusty and true lies only in the depths, which is something I quote however many times in the book, almost every chapter. It's almost kind of the theme song of the book, that sort of that tension between the great, spectacular exterior and sort of upper level, and then this world of the deep, the sort of the hidden world where the truth lies. And that's just a very central tension all through Wagner's work.
But the term Wagnerian is also simply used to describe the scale of his ambition and the scale of the work. The fact that the operas are 5 hours long is what most people think of.
Well, that's perfectly valid, of course. He was tremendously ambitious. I mean, how he kept going with this project of the Ring in exile in Zurich with no prospects whatsoever of performance, in a constant state of financial and personal chaos. Just day after day, churning out this work. I mean, there's this aspect of Wagner, which actually the Victorians talked about, and we don't talk about very much anymore, is the industriousness, sort of the sheer industriousness of this man who had his vision and saw it through successfully to its conclusion. But it's true. This was something remarkable about Wagner, that he made this utterly impractical scheme come to life, with, of course, some help from King Ludwig in the end.
Right. Well, speaking of industriousness, and I know our time is drawing to an end, somebody asked a very good interview ending question of what's your next book? I imagine that that's not something you want to think about. It's like, well, you finished that 10 years of work.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, it takes so long for a book to end, and it hasn't ended. Once you finish writing, you're on tour, which is just me sitting in my office right now. But but there's sort of this sort of work that goes along with putting out the book into the world. So I feel like it's only going to be early next year that it'll be sort of behind me, and I'll be able to start thinking about something else. Right now, I have absolutely no thought. If I wrote another book, I feel as though my urge would be to write something just a kind of 175-page book about the history of windshield wipers. So something very, very much more confined. Although I'm sure I'd find a way to make that gargantuan and sprawling. So I don't know. It's just me, I suppose. I would like to write. I'd rather have a book come out. In a 3 or 4 years as opposed to 10 or 12, so that's the goal.
Well, but 10 or 12 is a huge achievement to bring it out. It must be something to have it in your hands, assuming you have it in your hand, because I know many of us readers got it before you got it.
No, I have it here.
That's great. Yeah.
Somebody did ask about the choice of color for the cover. Was that you praising how attractive it is?
I think there was a sort of maybe a sort of slightly different shade of yellow or gold. I suggested making it sort of bringing out the gold a little more, because I just like the idea that it's sort of this sort of hunk of gold, which I would advise everyone to keep it immersed in water at all times. You don't want to let the gold. Sorry.
Post a picture to one of your social media accounts of how they had cut it in half to take it on a hiking trip with them.
Oh yeah,
I believe it's the book actually bisected.
Yeah, Kate Mollison of the BBC.
That was it. Yeah.
In Scotland, and I don't object to that at all. Perfectly valid. I suggested that she should have burned each page after she wrote it, because that was Wagner's original idea for The Ring, that the scroll would be burned.
Terrible idea for a journalist, though.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this last hour. Traditionally, we end the sessions by asking each of our guests to recommend a book, or in this case, a recording that they've been taken with, that you've been listening to or reading lately. And Anne, do you want to go first?
Well, sure. Right now I am reading, thanks to Alex,
Yeah.
Dorothy Richardson's 13-volume pilgrimage series, which was completely new to me.
Oh,
And
nice.
it feels like a book I should have discovered years ago. So I'm very grateful. And my audiobook going now is Karl Ove Knausgaard's My Struggle, which also seems Wagnerian in its ambitions. I am on volume 6 of that.
Wow.
Which I hear is the hardest one to get through. But
Yeah, you're getting close to the end. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
And Alex,
Let's see.
any recordings or books?
I just bought Rick Perlstein's Nixon Reaganland book.
Yeah, the third of his trilogy.
Yeah, and I'm a little ways into reading Kleist's Michael Kohlhaas in German.
Wow.
Slow going with my German tutor, who's been a huge help through this whole process. We went over all the translations in the book, so a shout out to Cyril Kuhn. But but there's actually, I understand there's an excellent new translation from New York Review Books of Michael Kohlhaas, which is
okay.
And in terms of reading, listening, of course, I just always have stacks and stacks of CDs. I'm still a CD person. But there's a new recording coming out of Ash Fury's music, who's a younger composer of just really extraordinary ability. And Igor Levit has a wonderful new album called Encounter.
Encounter, yeah. Yeah, if for those in the DC area, you can come by and browse our CD section. I can also order you some vinyl, but and you can also reach out to me. I'd be happy to ship you some CDs along with Alex's book. Speaking of which, please click on the chat link below and buy Alex's book. This is really the only way we can keep these author events going. And we have a lot of author events, and we just want to keep these going. So please support Alex and our store and independent bookstores. Just wanted to thank, mention politics-pros.com/events to look at our events, /music to look at music recommendations, and please stay in touch with us. I want to thank all the people who wrote wonderful questions. Sorry we didn't get to all of them. They were great. Wanted to thank Chairman James Holman of the Wagner Society. They wanted me to give you their website, which is www.wagner-dc.org. I want to thank Anne Midgette. We look forward to her book. Hope you can do an event at Politics and Prose. And I definitely want to thank Alex Ross for years and years of great work. Congratulations on your book. And thank you both. And thank you everybody for joining us. This was a wonderful event. And thank you again. Take care.
Thank you so much for having us.
All right.
Congratulations to Alex. All right.